My daughter-in-law whispered. She eats our food, takes up space, and gives us nothing. That night, I packed quietly and took $185,000 with me. I'm Cora. I'm 70 years old, and for most of my life, I believed in something simple that if you raise your children with love, they'll return it when your hair turns white. That belief used to keep me going. It was my faith, my comfort, my reward. But I've come to realize maybe too late that love doesn't always return the way you give it. And sometimes the most dangerous lies are the ones you tell yourself. I was born in a little town called Stillwater, Arkansas. It wasn't even on most maps. Just rows of cornfields, a few dusty roads, and the sound of chickens scratching in the dirt yard. Summers there smelled like sweat and pond water. Winters meant chopping wood until your hands bled. But it was home. A place where kids played with sticks, not screens. Where neighbors called through windows, not phones. My daddy named me Cora. He said it means heart. You'll be the heart of this family someday. At the time, I rolled my eyes. I thought it sounded too sentimental. But now I feel every beat of that name deep in my chest. I did become the heart, quietly pumping life into everyone else while no one stopped to check if I was tired. I grew up in a wooden house my father built with his own hands. The walls were thin, and the roof leaked when it rained, but there was laughter in that house. Real laughter, the kind that echoed through the kitchen while biscuits baked and dogs barked in the yard. I didn't have much, not toys, not pretty clothes, but I had warmth. I had people who looked me in the eye and saw me. Frank was one of them. I met him at the church picnic when I was 17. He wasn't flashy, just a quiet boy with work-worn hands and a gentle way of listening. He brought me a slice of watermelon and said, "You have a nice smile, Miss Cora." That was it. That was the start of everything. We married under a tree behind his family's barn. I wore a borrowed dress that smelled like lavender and age. Our wedding feast was nothing more than ham sandwiches and cornbread. I baked myself, but I felt like the richest girl in Stillwater as I had Frank, and that was all I ever really wanted. Together we built a life. A small one, a hard one, but it was ours. Frank worked 3 jobs during the factory strikes days at the plant nights, unloading freight weekends, fixing roofs for cash. I kept house and raised our 3 babies. We didn't eat if the kids weren't fed first. Sometimes Frank would skip dinner entirely and say, "Let them grow strong. We'll be okay." I still remember the night we realized we were out of heating oil in the dead of winter. Frank wrapped the kids in all the blankets we had, then pulled me close under his coat. We shivered together until morning. That was marriage. Not candlelight dinners, but surviving the cold as a team. Then came the cancer. Out of nowhere. One day he had a pain in his side. 2 months later, the doctor said the words that cracked my world open. Stage 4. Nothing we can do. I sold our truck. I borrowed from the church fund. I sat by his side as he shrank into someone I barely recognized. He never once complained. The night before he died, he touched my face and whispered, "Promise me, you'll eat well and don't work yourself to death." I nodded, even though my throat burned too much to speak. He passed away the next morning. The room was quiet except for my breathing and the sound of my heart breaking. It was the coldest day of the year. Snow covered the garden he once planted, now wilted and gray. I wore the same black coat I'd worn to my mother's funeral. After the burial, I came home to an empty house. His boots still sat by the door. His coffee mug was still in the sink. But the man who made that house feel like a home was gone. No pension, no savings, no one left but the kids. That's when I told myself, it's okay. I still have our children. I'll live for them now. I didn't need luxury. I didn't dream of cruises or condos. All I wanted was a seat at their table, a quiet room in their home, a warm meal shared with family who remembered I mattered. I truly believe that was enough. God help me. I truly believe that was enough. That morning started like any other. I was standing by the stove waiting for the kettle to boil, scooping instant coffee into my chipped blue mug, the same one I'd used for 15 years. The kitchen window was open just a crack, letting in the early spring air still damp with dew. Birds were chirping somewhere out near the fence post. Then came the knock. Firm. Short. Like someone who didn't plan on staying long. I opened the door to find a man in a beige windbreaker holding a clipboard. He introduced himself as someone from the county's land development office. I squinted against the sun as he pointed out to the field next to my house, the little patch of land with a leaning fence and wildflowers that bloomed on their own schedule. Used to be my parents'. My daddy planted corn there when I was a girl, and later it just sat quiet, untouched except for the occasional rabbit trail cutting through the tall grass. He cleared his throat, said something about a new federal highway cutting through this part of Arkansas. Éminent domaine. Compensation. My ears didn't quite catch everything at first, not until he said the number $185,000. I sat down before I even realized I needed to, my hands folded on my lap, fingers tightening. The numbers echoed in my head like church bells on Sunday morning. I hadn't seen that many zeros in my entire life. $185,000. I never imagined for a moment it didn't feel real. Like he'd gotten the wrong address. Like maybe I was still asleep and dreaming in the armchair by the radio. After he left, I sat at the kitchen table in silence. The kettle had gone cold. My coffee still sat dry in the mug. This wasn't money I'd earned. I hadn't worked for it, hadn't bled or sweated or saved to make it appear. This was land passed down from folks who came long before me, folks who had dirt under their nails and hope in their chests. I thought of my father's voice the way he used to hum, while turning the soil the way my mother used to press corn husks into bundles for drying. This wasn't mine, not really. It was theirs, and I had to do right by it. I didn't tell anyone at first, not even the neighbor who sometimes dropped by with peach cobbler. I tucked the official letter into the back of my recipe book behind the page for chicken pot pie. I wasn't ready to say it out loud, afraid the words might turn the money into something dangerous. Later that afternoon, the phone rang. The screen lit up Ethan. My heart jumped. He hadn't called in months. Not since Christmas. And even then, just a quick "love you, Mom." And gone again. I picked it up, my thumb trembling slightly as I slid across the screen. "Hey, Mom." He said, his voice soft, like he'd been thinking about this for a while. "How are you doing out there? Still getting around okay?" I smiled without meaning to. "I'm doing all right, sweetheart. Still kicking." Then after a pause, he said, "Listen, I was thinking, why don't you come stay with us for a while? I know it's a small place, but we can make room. It's time you stopped living alone." Something caught in my throat. I hadn't realized how much I needed to hear those words, that someone was thinking of me not just as a mother or a grandmother but as someone worth having around. I closed my eyes for a second and let his voice fill the quiet. The kitchen didn't feel so empty all of a sudden. I thought back to when Ethan was little, how he used to wait on the front steps when I worked the late shift at the bakery, clutching a brown bag of donated rolls and his tiny flashlight. He never complained, not once, just wrapped his arms around me when I got home and asked, "Did you eat yet, Mama?" Maybe now was my turn to sit on someone else's porch, to be wrapped in warmth again. After the call, I stayed at the table a long time. My coffee had gone cold twice by then. I smiled to myself, the kind of smile you hide even when you're alone. "I'll go," I whispered. "But I'll pack light. I won't be a burden." Ethan must have sensed it because he said, "Don't say that, Mom. You're my mother." A simple sentence, but to me it was everything. A recognition. A belonging. Proof that I was still more than just someone who used to matter. The next morning, I opened the cedar chest at the foot of my bed. The smell of mothballs and thyme hit me like a memory. I folded a few dresses tucked in the scarf Frank had given me for our 30th anniversary, a pale wool thing I'd only worn once too nice for daily use. I wrapped our wedding photo in a towel and slid it between two sweaters. The corners were fading, but Frank's eyes still looked at me the same, still steady. Last, I took the savings passbook from the top drawer and slipped it into the side pocket of my fabric purse. Still had my name on it. I hadn't told anyone about it yet. Not Ethan, not his wife. I wasn't hiding it. I just needed to hold on to something that was mine just for a while longer. Maybe I'd help them later if they needed it. Maybe I'd offer to fix up their kitchen or chip in for the girls' college funds. But first I needed to carry it to remember that I had something left that didn't come from giving something that came from being. The morning light streamed through the kitchen as I zipped up my bag. The birds were still singing. The house still creaked in the same places. But for the first time in years I felt like I was leaving, not out of necessity but out of hope. The next morning I left Stillwater on a northbound bus that smelled faintly of vinyl and gasoline. I didn't carry much, just a small backpack slung over my shoulder and a cloth bag clutched to my chest. Inside it were the things that made me feel like myself. A jar of homemade peach preserves, a little container of peanut butter I'd stirred by hand with honey, and 3 sachets of herbal tea made from lemon balm and mint growing wild along the edge of my garden. My hands had packed them with care. I didn't want to arrive empty-handed, even if I was just a guest. I was still a mother, still a grandmother. That meant something. The bus rumbled along the highway, bouncing over potholes as the landscape slowly shifted. The endless fields of Arkansas corn gave way to scrubland, then to brick buildings, faded billboards, and finally the wide gray sprawl that meant we were nearing Chicago. I watched it all pass by through a smudged window. The sun glinted off the metal roof of a barn, the last familiar thing before the city swallowed us whole. My fingers tightened around the cloth bag in my lap. I whispered to myself, "Wherever my children are, that's where I belong." I wanted to believe that. I needed to believe that. By the time the driver called our stop, the air outside had turned hot and thick, like breathing through cotton. Chicago summer didn't feel like Stillwater summer. It wasn't the kind of heat that made you sweat under a porch fan while sipping iced tea. This was hard heat, heavy. The kind that stuck to your back and made your knees ache. I stepped off the bus and blinked into the sun. The station was little more than a shaded bench on the edge of a parking lot. Asphalt shimmered under the weight of the noon sun. My shoes, good leather ones I'd polished the night before, felt too tight. I had imagined this moment so many times, but I hadn't prepared for how sharp the world would feel outside my quiet little town. My bag was heavier than I remembered. I slung the backpack behind me and held the cloth parcel in both arms, trying not to squint too hard. I looked around for Ethan. People were rushing past, men in colored shirts with briefcases, women talking on phones, a boy selling water bottles out of a cooler. But no sign of my son. I found a spot in the shade beneath a crooked metal awning, sat down slowly on the bench, and folded my hands over the cloth bag. I could feel the jar of peach preserves still warm from the sun. I hoped the seal had held. I imagined handing it to my granddaughter. Would she like it? Would she remember that Grandma Cora came from a place where peaches still grew on trees? I glanced down at my watch. It was nearly 20 minutes past noon. Maybe he hit traffic. Maybe he forgot. No, I told myself he wouldn't forget. I adjusted my scarf and tried to smooth the front of my blouse, now damp with sweat. I should have brought a hat. I hadn't traveled this far from home in nearly 15 years. Back then it was for Frank's funeral. A low honk startled me. Ethan pulled up in an old pickup that coughed once before sputtering to a stop. When he stepped out, I barely recognized the boy I once cradled on my hip. His hair, once the color of corn silk in the summer sun, was now streaked with gray. Lines marked his forehead deep. Tired creases I hadn't noticed in the photos he occasionally texted. I touched his cheek when he leaned in to hug me. "You've aged, sweetheart." I almost whispered, though I bit my tongue. It wasn't judgment, just the ache of seeing how time had burdened him. I told myself then and there, I'm here to ease things, not add to the weight. The ride through the Chicago streets was jarring. I sat quietly in the passenger seat, hands folded in my lap, my bag at my feet. My eyes darted left and right at the blur of honking cars, cyclists weaving like thread through rush hour, and pedestrians shouting into their phones. Traffic. Something else up here. I said with a shaky laugh. Ethan chuckled. Yeah, you get used to it. But I wasn't sure I ever would. Still sitting beside him, hearing his voice was like balm on a burn I didn't know I'd been carrying. When we pulled into the apartment complex, my breath caught a little. A narrow brick building with faded green railings, cracked pavement, and a row of overstuffed trash bins by the side. The place had known better years. I didn't say a word. We climbed the stairs. 3 flights, no elevator. I told him I was fine, though my knees ached with each step, and my breath came shorter than I liked. I clutched the cloth bag close to my chest, careful not to bump it against the railings. It was silly, but I kept thinking about the preserves and the peanut butter inside as if they'd break and spill, and along with them something of me. When we reached the door, it was already ajar. Claire stood in the hallway barefoot, one hand stirring something on the stove and the other thumbing her phone. She glanced up briefly. "Oh, hi. You're here," she said, her voice flat, already drifting back into her scrolling. I smiled anyway and held out the jar. "I brought peach jam. Thought the kids might like it." She gave a half nod and placed it on the counter without looking. The living room was cramped. Toys everywhere. Plastic dinosaurs, stuffed bears, puzzle pieces underfoot. A blaring television fought with the sound of boiling water. The baby wailed from the next room. Claire raised her voice. "Quiet down, Grandma's here," I winked. I wasn't expecting a welcome banner, but something about the way she said Grandma made me feel like a stranger. The next morning, I woke early, long before anyone else. My body ached from the climb, from the unfamiliar bed, from the sudden change in air. Still, I swept the floor, wiped down the counters, folded a basket of clean clothes sitting on the couch. No one had asked me to, but it felt good to be useful. It always had. In the days that followed, I settled into a quiet rhythm. I took the baby to daycare each morning, bundled in layers he always wriggled out of. I picked him up in the afternoon, fed him mashed sweet potatoes, wiped his little hands and changed him while he kicked and squealed. I cooked dinner. Nothing fancy. Just the simple things I knew: meatloaf, green beans, cornbread. No one said much during meals, but no one complained either. My back began to act up on the 5th day, a stabbing pain that ran from my shoulder down to my hip. That evening, while scrubbing the bathtub, I had to stop midway and sit on the cold tile. I stayed there for 10 minutes, breathing through it. But when the baby called out, "Grandma, give me a piggyback," I got up. One night, over a dinner of baked chicken and rice, I cleared my throat and said softly, "I've got some money from the land back home. Was thinking of putting it into a savings account. Could help with bills, maybe?" I wasn't sure how they'd take it. I didn't want them to feel I was buying space, but I also didn't want to sit idle knowing Ethan was struggling. Before Ethan could say a word, Claire perked up from her seat, her eyes lighting up for the first time since I'd arrived. "Oh, I can help with that," she said cheerily. "I know someone at the bank. They'll get you a great rate. Just hand over your info. I'll set everything up for you." She smiled, a real smile, the kind that made me think, maybe she's warming up to me after all. I nodded, slowly, surprised, unsure whether to feel relieved or wary. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat alone at the kitchen table long after they'd gone to bed, my hands wrapped around a lukewarm mug of chamomile. The apartment was silent now. Toys were tucked away. The baby was asleep. I looked at the jar of jam still unopened on the shelf. I'm still useful, I told myself. I'm still someone who can help. I didn't notice the shadow forming behind those words, the faint shape of something else. But in that moment, all I saw was a quiet kitchen, the sound of a refrigerator humming, and the image of my son's back bent slightly at the dinner table as he scrolled through bills on his phone. That night I couldn't sleep. My head throbbed dully, a deep pulsing ache behind my eyes that refused to go away no matter how I turned on the couch. I lay there for what felt like hours, listening to the sounds of the city, distant sirens, the hum of the refrigerator, the soft creak of pipes behind the walls. I didn't want to wake anyone, so I slipped the blanket off carefully and tiptoed toward the kitchen. My knees ached with every step and the floorboards groaned beneath my weight, even though I tried to move like a whisper. It was a habit now. The kind that forms when you live in someone else's house, walk softly, speak less, disappear when possible. As I passed by Ethan and Claire's bedroom, I heard voices, soft but sharp like the edge of a broken plate. I paused. I should have kept walking, but something about the way Claire said Mom made my feet root to the floor. I wasn't eavesdropping, I told myself that. I just froze. Maybe because some part of me already knew what was coming. Claire's voice was tight and bitter. I'm exhausted, Ethan. I work all day, and then I come home to this. Your mother's here needing everything, and the kids won't leave me alone for a second. My breath caught. I pressed my back to the wall. She's taken over the living room. Claire continued. We don't even have a space to sit anymore. She just sprawls out like she lives here. My hands trembled. That living room, if you could call it that, barely had room for my blanket and a folding chair. I didn't even unpack my second bag. I thought I'd been invisible enough. Then Claire's voice dipped into something worse. She keeps talking about helping, about giving us money. Where is it? I haven't seen a single cent. Just talks and promises like we're supposed to wait around and beg. I felt something twist in my chest. I hadn't told them yet because I didn't know how. The money wasn't just mine. It felt like a relic, a piece of my parents, a sliver of land turned into paper. I wanted to give, but I also wanted to feel like it was my choice. Ethan didn't argue. He just sighed long. Tired. If she leaves, he said. Who's going to watch the kids? Who's going to cook and clean? You want to do all that on top of everything else that broke something in me. Not just the words, but the way he said them. As if I wasn't his mother anymore, but a solution. A placeholder. A free maid. Claire laughed short. Sharp. So we just keep her around for convenience, huh? I closed my eyes and for a moment I couldn't breathe. That line, keep her around like I was an old lamp. Someone was too lazy to toss. I felt the heat in my cheeks, but not from shame. From something colder. Something like being erased. I stood there behind the wall, listening to my child and his wife carve away my dignity piece by piece. I didn't cry. I couldn't even. The tears felt ashamed to fall. I turned slowly and crept back down the hallway, the shadows wrapping around me like a blanket that no longer warmed. The next morning I woke up before dawn. Same as always. I brewed coffee, flipped pancakes, sliced apples into tiny wedges the way the kids liked. My hand shook as I poured hot water for the oatmeal, and a splash landed on the back of my hand. The sting was sharp, but I didn't flinch. I just turned the tap and ran cold water over the burn while my other hand kept stirring. No one noticed, and I preferred it that way. At breakfast, Claire said thanks without looking up. The kids giggled sticky with syrup, asking me to tie their shoes. I smiled. I wiped their mouths. I said nothing. Ethan didn't speak much either. He never mentioned the money again, never asked about my hand even though the burn left a red welt. He looked tired. He always did. But now his tiredness felt distant, like he was keeping it for himself, along with whatever pieces of affection he once had for me. When I spoke to him, he'd just nod or mutter something low, his eyes already somewhere else. The warmth I remembered from my boy gone. Maybe it had been gone a while and I just hadn't wanted to see it. Every time I sat down for a moment, I'd hear those words again. Keep her here to make use of her. Like a scratched record playing in the background of my mind, always stuck on the same cruel loop. I couldn't scrub them out with bleach or drown them in dishwater. They lived inside me now. Part of the air I breathed in that apartment. One afternoon, rain began to fall in long silver sheets. Claire had forgotten to pick up milk. I didn't ask. I put on my old rain jacket thin as tissue and walked the 6 blocks to the store. The cold rain hit like tiny slaps against my face. My shoes soaked through in minutes, but I kept walking. The milk was heavy in the plastic bag as I carried it home. On the way back, I slipped slightly on the slick sidewalk. Nothing dramatic, just enough to make my heart jump. I held onto a mailbox until the pavement stopped spinning. My fingers were numb, my knees aching. When I stepped through the door, dripping onto the entryway, Claire glanced at me from the couch. "You went out in that?" she asked, not with concern but irritation. I sneezed, half laughing, trying to shake off the chill. She didn't smile, just muttered, "If you slip and break something, it's going to be a whole mess. You should have just waited." I stood there for a second, still holding the milk. Water pooled around my shoes. I realized she wasn't scolding me for getting sick. She was warning me not to become a problem. I wasn't a guest. I wasn't family. I was a potential liability. I dried off in the hallway. No one asked if I was okay. No one looked up when I walked past the living room to put the milk in the fridge. That night, when I sat at the kitchen table alone, towel wrapping my feet and sipping reheated tea, I looked at the little blister on my hand and thought, at least this hurt makes sense. That night I lay on the thin mattress on the floor of my grandson's room. The ceiling above me blurred in the dim glow of the hallway light that spilled through the cracked door. My blanket was too short. My feet cold and my hands curled stiffly against my chest, wrinkled, purple from the chill. I stared at them for a long time, barely blinking. These were the same hands that once held Ethan's feverish body against mine when he was just a baby. The same hands that sewed patches into his jeans when he scuffed them playing in the yard. Now they looked like someone else's. Forgotten relics that no longer belonged. Claire's words echoed again as they did every night. "You're just keeping her here to make use of her." No one repeated it aloud, but it was there in the silence when I entered a room, in the brief glance, when I dropped a plate, in the way Claire pulled her coffee mug out of my hands before I could refill it. I wasn't a guest. I wasn't even unwanted. I was tolerated like an old appliance, too heavy to move, too functional to throw away. I closed my eyes, but sleep didn't come. I thought of Frank, my Frank, and the way he used to quietly sand down the wooden stair rail each winter so it wouldn't splinter. How he always reached out a hand when I stepped off the porch, even when I was still young and steady. He never said much, but his presence spoke louder than any comfort I've known since. With him, I had worth not because I was useful, but because I was his. As I was Cora now in this sleek apartment with its humming refrigerator and flat-screen television, I felt like an undocumented stranger. No one had stripped me of my identity outright, but I had somehow become invisible. No language, no country, no right to speak. I wasn't angry about the money. I wasn't angry about the couch, the chores, the silence. I was angry about being reduced to a function after all the years I had poured into my family. Every meal, every scraped knee, every sleepless night. I had become a convenience, not a mother, not a person. The streetlight poured in through the window, casting a long, pale line across the floor. I sat in that glow, unmoving, hollowed out. And in that hush of early morning, I whispered to the dark, "Maybe it's time I left." 2 days later, I knocked lightly on Ethan's door. My voice hoarse but steady. "I've been thinking," I said. "I might go back to Maplewood for a few days. Visit my cousin Lillian." He looked surprised, blinking like he'd just missed something obvious. "What for everything?" "Okay, Mom." I gave him a small smile. "It's just a little cramped here, that's all. I'm used to more space, fewer people." It was a gentle lie, not meant to wound, not even meant to stir guilt. Just a way of easing myself out without asking for permission. I'd already made peace with the truth. If I waited for someone to ask me to stay, I might never leave. From the kitchen, Claire called out without turning around. "That's a good idea, Mom. A little fresh air might do you some good." Her voice carried a hint of relief coated in casual politeness. Not cruel. Just done. I heard it for what it was, not an insult but an exhale. And it cut deeper than any harsh word. I packed quietly the next morning. A few spring sweaters, my bottle of headache pills, the faded wedding photo of Frank and me. The savings book stayed folded inside the hem of my purse, still untouched, still in my name. I didn't need much. I had already left most of myself behind. When I wheeled my suitcase toward the door, no one followed. No arms wrapped around me. No goodbyes. Only my little grandson, barefoot in his pajamas, came running up the hallway. He hugged my leg tightly, kissed my cheek with a sticky mouth, and whispered, "Grandma, don't forget my chips." I crouched down to kiss the top of his head. My hand trembled slightly as I tucked a curl behind his ear. I didn't cry. Not in front of him. The tears stayed hidden, pressing into my palms as I clutched that old photo to my chest. I wasn't grieving the departure. I was mourning the dream that had kept me going all these years. One where love alone was enough to bind people together. As the bus pulled away from the station, I sat by the window and watched the city melt behind layers of glass and smog. Orn's construction. Hurried lives. It all shrank into the background like the end of a film I'd stayed too long to finish. Nothing was holding me there anymore. No room left for a mother. No space for anything but silence. The farther we drove, the clearer the sky became. The fields opened up like familiar arms. Patches of rice and soy stretched toward the horizon, glistening under soft clouds. The scent of soil and spring drifted in through a cracked window. My lungs filled differently, fuller. Less filtered. It was the air of my own beginnings. And I realized in that moment that I didn't need to explain myself anymore. Not to Ethan. Not to Claire. Not to anyone. I wasn't leaving in anger. I wasn't escaping. I was returning. Not just to Stillwater, but to the part of myself I had locked away long ago for the sake of being needed. The land outside rolled gently like it remembered me. And I let it hold me again quietly. Without question. When I stepped off the bus in Maplewood, the air felt lighter even if it was thick with early spring pollen. My knees ached from the ride and the handle of my suitcase had left a deep red mark on my fingers. But then I saw her. Louise. Waiting on the curb in her old knitted shawl, her hair pinned up just like back in high school. She walked right up to me without a word and pulled me into a tight hug. "You came home," she said into my ear. Her voice cracked with time, but her arms hadn't changed. She held on like I was something precious. Returned, not something broken, fleeing. In that moment, I wasn't Ethan's mother, Claire's nuisance, or some quiet shadow sneaking around an apartment. I was just Cora. Her Cora. No pretense, no utility to see me. Her house was a small, weathered cabin on the edge of town. The paint had peeled in places and the screen door wheezed when it opened. But when I placed my bags down and sank into the creaky rocking chair on her porch, I exhaled for what felt like the first time in years. The cushions were faded. The wood groaned under my weight, but nothing in that space asked anything from me. The air smelled like pine and damp soil. In the distance, I could hear a chainsaw, probably from old Mr. Bennett's farm, and the whistle of a freight train sliding through the valley. Louise handed me a warm mug of chamomile tea, then let me sit in silence. The sun slanted low through the chestnut trees, casting gentle light over the porch steps. The wind carried a few lazy leaves in circles near my feet. And as the light faded, the only sounds left were the chirping of sparrows and the soft rustle of wind sneaking through the rafters. I leaned my head back, pulled the shawl tighter around my shoulders, and closed my eyes. For the first time in months, I fell asleep. Not out of exhaustion. Not because my body had given out, but because I was at peace. The kind of sleep that does not end in tears or dread, but in a quiet hum of satisfaction and a faint smile. I woke up the next morning feeling lighter, a kind of lightness I hadn't known since Frank was alive. The ache in my knees was still there, a constant companion, but it felt less like a burden and more like a reminder of how far I'd come. I stretched the old joints, protesting, but I got up, walked to the kitchen, and poured myself a cup of the strong black coffee Louise always had brewing. The morning light through Louise's kitchen window was different from the harsh, filtered light of Ethan and Claire's apartment. Here it was soft, warm, illuminating dust motes, dancing in the air and casting long shadows from the potted herbs on the sill. It smelled of coffee and old wood and something else, something peaceful. Louise was already up, sitting at her own small kitchen table, carefully mending a tear in a quilt with tiny, precise stitches. She looked up and smiled, a genuine, crinkly-eyed smile that reached her heart. "Sleep well, hon?" she asked, her voice soft. like a baby. I replied and I meant it. We spent the day quietly. Louise put me to work. Not out of necessity, but out of companionship. We shelled peas from her small garden, their crisp snap a soothing rhythm. We sorted through old photographs, the images fading but the memories sharp. There was one of Frank and me at the county fair, both of us impossibly young and grinning, holding hands. My chest tightened for a moment, a familiar pang, but it wasn't the searing pain of grief anymore. It was a gentle ache, a quiet remembering. I saw pictures of Ethan as a chubby-cheeked toddler, then a gangly teenager. Akiet, si escaped me. Louise looked up. Regrets, Cora? She asked, her needle paused mid-stitch. I shook my head slowly. Not regrets exactly. More like a realization. That the future I built for myself, the one I thought was set in stone, was just an illusion. And that letting go of it even when it hurt was the only way to find something real. I explained to Louise about the land money. About how it had sat untouched, a symbol of a past I was trying to honor. And how in their apartment it had become a weapon in Claire's hands. Something they expected. Something they felt entitled to. Louise just listened, her eyes warm and understanding. That money's your independence, Cora, she said finally. Don't let anyone take that from you. Not again. Later that week, I went to the local bank. A small, friendly place, nothing like the bustling, impersonal branches in Chicago. I spoke to a kind woman named Martha who listened patiently as I explained my situation, glossing over the painful details. I opened my own account, a simple savings account, and deposited the $185,000. Seeing my name on the new passbook, clear and unburdened, felt like a small victory. It wasn't about the money itself, not really. It was about choice. About having something that was unequivocally mine. Something that didn't come with strings attached or silent expectations. I still intended to help Ethan and his family, but it would be on my terms, when and how I chose, not as a bribe for a place to sleep. It would be a gift given freely, not a transaction for my worth. The days in Maplewood settled into a comforting rhythm. I helped Louise with her garden, pulling weeds until my back protested. But the sun on my face and the smell of damp earth were medicine. We cooked simple meals, and sometimes the neighbors would bring over fresh eggs or a basket of late-season tomatoes, and we'd share a meal on the porch as the fireflies blinked in the twilight. The quiet conversations, the easy laughter, the feeling of being genuinely wanted and appreciated, these were the things that truly began to heal me. I decided not to contact Ethan or Claire immediately. I needed space. I needed to solidify this new sense of self, this quiet empowerment. I knew they would eventually realize I was gone, but the thought no longer filled me with dread. Instead, it was replaced by a strange sense of calm. I had given them my whole life, my entire being. It was time to give something back to Cora. One afternoon, about 3 weeks after I left Chicago, my phone rang. It was Ethan. My heart gave a little jump, but it wasn't the anxious flutter it used to be. It was more like a small thud, a recognition. Mom, he said, his voice hesitant, a little frantic. Where are you? Claire said you went to Lillian's, but she hasn't heard from you, and you're not answering her calls. He sounded genuinely worried, but there was also an underlying tone of inconvenience. I could almost hear Claire in the background prompting him. I'm here, sweetheart. I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the old aches. I've been here. I needed a break. A break? He echoed, a note of disbelief. Mom, the kids. Claire's swamped. We need you. The words hit me, but they didn't cut as deeply as they once did. I know, Ethan. I replied. And I want to help. But I need to do it on my own terms now. I've been taking care of everyone for so long I forgot how to take care of myself. There was a pause, a long, uncomfortable silence. Mom, what are you talking about? Are you mad about something? He finally asked, clearly confused. It was clear he genuinely had no idea of the depths of my quiet desperation in their home. The lack of malicious intent, just thoughtlessness, was almost more painful. No, Ethan. Not mad. Just clear. I took a deep breath. I won't be living with you anymore. But I'm going to set up a small trust for the girls' education, and I'll send money each month for their daycare. And if you ever need help with a specific big expense, a car repair or something, you can ask. But I need my own space now. My own peace. He spluttered, trying to interrupt, but I kept talking calmly and clearly. I told him about the money from the land, which surprised him, and how it was now secure. I explained that I wanted to use it wisely for myself and for genuine help, not as an indefinite resource for their household expenses. There was a long silence on the other end. I could almost hear his mind working, the gears grinding. Finally, he spoke, his voice lower, a touch of genuine emotion in it this time. Mum, I'm sorry. I guess I didn't see it. He didn't elaborate, but that was enough. A small crack in the wall. I know, Ethan. I said gently. It's hard to see things when you're busy with your own life. But I need to be seen now. The conversation ended with a promise from him to visit soon. A promise I knew might be broken, but it was a step. I wasn't expecting an apology from Claire, and I didn't get one. Her occasional text to Ethan, which he'd forward to me, still carried a hint of distant grievance, a frustration at the sudden shift in our dynamic, but I learned to read them, to see them for what they were, her own struggles, not reflections, of my worth. Life with Louise wasn't perfect, but it was real. We had our squabbles about burnt toast or how much sugar to put in the tea, but they were small surface, things easily resolved with a shared laugh. I started painting again, a hobby I'd abandoned years ago. Louise found an old easel in her attic, dusty and paint-splattered but still functional. I set it up on the porch facing the chestnut trees and lost myself for hours in the colors and the quiet. I wasn't trying to be an artist. I was just trying to feel again. I even started volunteering at the local library, reading stories to the little ones. Their bright, curious faces were a balm to my soul. They didn't ask anything of me beyond the joy of a good story, and their innocent laughter filled a void I hadn't realized was so vast. I saw my granddaughter once when Ethan brought her to Maplewood for a quick visit. She was still sticky-mouthed and boisterous, and she hugged me fiercely. "Grandma Cora, you're back," she exclaimed. It was a simple phrase, but it meant the world. I held her close, inhaling the scent of her hair, and for a fleeting moment, I saw the unbroken thread of love that still connected us. Looking back, I understand now that sometimes the hardest decisions are the ones that save you. It wasn't revenge I sought. It was self-preservation. It was about recognizing my worth not as a caregiver or a bank account, but as a person still capable of growth, still deserving of peace. I don't harbor bitterness, not anymore. Bitterness is a poison, and I've spent too much of my life being quietly poisoned. There's a certain freedom that comes with age, with realizing that you don't have to keep playing roles that no longer fit. The expectations of others can be a heavy cloak, and sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself is to simply lay it down. My life now is quiet. Peaceful. I wake with the sun, drink my coffee on the porch, listening to the birds. I walk through Louise's garden, admiring the tenacity of the weeds and the beauty of the blooming roses. I spend my afternoons painting, reading, or simply sitting, breathing in the clean air, feeling the sun on my skin. I send the money to Ethan and Claire for the girls, a fixed amount each month, no questions asked. I'm building a small, healthy distance, a boundary that protects both them and me. There's no big dramatic ending to my story. No grand confrontation that went viral. Just a quiet, determined reclaiming of my own life. One breath, one brushstroke, one peaceful moment at a time. The scars are still there, deep and real, but they are no longer bleeding. They are simply part of the story, a reminder of the strength I found when I finally chose myself. And that after a lifetime of giving is the most profound freedom I could ever ask for.